The air inside Clarence House did not just feel cold. It felt heavy, as if the very walls were exhaling the weight of 1,000 years of history. It was precisely 9:15 on a gray, overcast London morning in late September 2025. Outside, the world went about its business. Tourists snapped photos of the stoic guards, and the city hummed with the usual frantic energy. But behind the imposing double oak doors of the king's private study, a silence had fallen that was so absolute it felt like the heartbeat of the monarchy itself had skipped. This was not a scheduled briefing. There were no cameras, no press secretaries with polished smiles, and no glimmer of royal pageantry. Instead, an emergency session had been convened in such absolute secrecy that not even the most seasoned royal correspondents had a whisper of it. In the room stood the king's closest legal advisors, their faces drained of any color, and two senior courtiers, who looked as though they had aged a decade overnight. Between them stood the king's private secretary, his knuckles white as he clutched a leather-bound folder marked in bold, jarring red letters. Confidential domestic action. Then the doors opened. King Charles III walked in, but he was not the confident sovereign the public had seen just days before. He was visibly trembling. His steps were slow, deliberate, as if he were walking through deep water as he took his seat at the head of the long mahogany table. His hands shook so violently that he had to lace his fingers together to keep them still. His eyes, rimmed with red from what looked like days of exhaustion and perhaps tears, could barely meet the gaze of the men he had trusted for a lifetime. When he finally spoke, his voice did not carry the usual resonant authority of a monarch. It cracked. It was the sound of a man on the edge of a total emotional collapse. He delivered the words that would instantly ignite a firestorm and echo through the corridors of history for centuries to come. He looked at his advisors and whispered, "I intend to separate from Queen Camilla." For several seconds, the silence returned, deeper and more terrifying than before. The men in the room were veterans of royal scandals. They had navigated the abdication crisis stories of 1936 and the catastrophic divorce of Charles and Diana in 1996. But this was different. This was the sitting sovereign, a man who had spent more than 30 years defending the woman he loved against a world that had once hated her. He had risked his reputation, his relationship with his mother, and his very crown to ensure that Camilla would one day sit beside him as queen. And now, at the pinnacle of their journey, he was throwing it all away. Witnesses would later whisper that Charles looked like a man who had been struck by lightning. This was not a decision born of a whim or a petty argument. This was a man forced to choose between his heart and his throne. According to one senior advisor present at that meeting, the king said something that would haunt every person who heard it. This has become untenable. The trust is broken beyond repair. To understand the magnitude of this moment, one must look at the historical precedent or the lack thereof. This marks the very first royal divorce of a sitting sovereign in over 400 years. Not since the reign of Henry VIII in the 16th century has a reigning monarch taken such a drastic and public step to sever a marital bond. We all know how those Tudor fractures ended with the shattering of the church and the reshaping of the Western world. While Charles was not looking to start a reformation, the constitutional and existential implications were just as grave. But what could possibly drive a man who had fought so hard for this marriage to end it now? What could be so devastating that it would shatter a bond forged in 30 years of shared battles? The answer lay inside that red-labeled folder, a damning intelligence report delivered to the king just 8 days before that fateful morning. This was not a report about an affair or a financial scandal. It was far more insidious. It was a dossier detailing a sophisticated web of media manipulation, one that was linked directly to the Queen's inner circle. For years, Charles had believed that he and Camilla were a united front against the relentless glare of the tabloids. But when he read those pages, when he saw the evidence of what had been happening behind his back, something inside him simply broke. The report alleged that strategic leaks had been orchestrated to elevate the Queen's public image at the direct expense of other family members, including the king's own sons and even the king himself. It was manipulation cloaked as loyalty. And for Charles, a man who values the institution above all else, it was the ultimate betrayal. The monarchy was already weathering a perfect storm, with the king facing his own health challenges following a cancer diagnosis and the public's trust hanging by a single fraying thread. This announcement was a controlled detonation. Charles knew that if this information reached the public before he took action, the crown might not survive the fallout. He was a man on a lonely island, realizing that the person he thought was his greatest ally might actually be the greatest threat to his legacy. But as the king prepared to sign the initial documents, he knew this was only the first domino to fall. Because while his marriage was collapsing in private, his brother, Prince Andrew, was about to bring the rest of the house down in public. The shock at Clarence House was just the beginning of a month that would redefine the British royal family forever. Little did the king know, the ghost of a woman named Virginia Giuffre was about to emerge from the shadows of the past, carrying a memoir that would leave the Duke of York with nowhere left to hide. While the king was grappling with the devastating betrayal of his wife behind the closed doors of Clarence House, a far more ancient and vengeful shadow was creeping across the Atlantic, heading straight for the heart of the British monarchy. It was the shadow of a woman who had spent more than 2 decades fighting to be heard, only to find her ultimate victory in the haunting silence of the grave. Her name was Virginia Giuffre, and although she was no longer alive to see it, her final words were about to do what no lawyer or prosecutor had managed to accomplish. They were going to strip a prince of his dignity, his home, and his very name. For years, Virginia had shared fragments of her story, tales of Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, and the powerful men who had treated her like a disposable commodity. But the world had never seen the full, unvarnished truth until the publication of her memoir, titled Nobody's Girl. The timing was as tragic as it was explosive. Virginia had taken her own life in April of 2025, leaving behind a manuscript that acted as a legal and emotional time bomb. When the book was finally released in October of that same year, it didn't just climb the charts, it obliterated them. Even before its official release date, the memoir had leaped to the #1 spot on Amazon globally. As millions of readers waited to see the written evidence of a nightmare, what they found inside was a narrative of such raw, emotional authenticity that it made every previous denial from the palace seem hollow and cruel. Virginia's account focused heavily on Prince Andrew, and the details she provided were as specific as they were disturbing. She described in agonizing detail being forced into intimate relations with the Duke on 3 separate occasions when she was only 17 years old. The most chilling passage in the book recounted their very first meeting at Ghislaine Maxwell's London home. Virginia wrote that Maxwell had leaned in and whispered to her, telling her that just like Cinderella, she was going to meet a handsome prince that night, but there was no fairy tale to be found. According to the memoir, Andrew had not been a charming royal guest. He had been a man who correctly guessed her age and then, with a terrifying lack of empathy, mentioned that his own daughters were only slightly younger than she was. That single detail, documented in her final testimony, sent a jolt of electricity through the British public. It painted a portrait of a man who wasn't just unaware of the gravity of his actions, but who was actively indifferent to them. The memoir's power lay in its ability to expose Andrew's psychological state. Virginia wrote that the prince seemed to believe that having access to her was his birthright. She described an attitude of staggering entitlement, a belief that his status as a royal meant that the laws of man and the boundaries of morality simply did not apply to him. This wasn't just a story about a crime. It was a story about the arrogance of power. As the pages turned, the allegations grew even more damaging. Virginia revealed that during their long-standing legal battle, Andrew's team had reportedly attempted to hire internet trolls to harass and discredit her online. She spoke of his security personnel being used to dig up dirt on her past in an attempt to silence her. But perhaps the most devastating revelation for the king was Virginia's account of Andrew's cowardice. She described how he had fled to Queen Elizabeth's Balmoral Castle in Scotland, hiding behind its well-guarded gates and using the elderly monarch's protection as a shield to make it impossible for her lawyers to serve him legal papers. The image of a grown man, a veteran of the Fallen's War, hiding behind his mother's skirts to avoid the consequences of his actions, was an image the public could not forgive. The release of Nobody's Girl created a perfect storm of outrage that could not have come at a worse time for the royal family. King Charles was already in the midst of his own battle with cancer, and the monarchy was struggling to find its footing in a rapidly changing modern Britain. The sympathy generated by Virginia's tragic death, combined with the graphic nature of her allegations, forced the king's hand. He realized that the Andrew problem was no longer a private family matter. It was an existential threat to the crown itself. But while the king was considering his options, he was being pushed toward a radical solution by his eldest son. Prince William had been watching the situation with a cold, calculated fury. He knew that for the monarchy to survive into the next generation, his generation, it had to be seen as an institution of accountability and integrity. William reportedly held several private meetings with his father, delivering an ultimatum. The monarchy could not have a future as long as Andrew was part of its present. William believed that every day Andrew remained a royal highness was a day the family sent a message that they were above the law. He told his father that they needed to fix the situation before it permanently stained William's own future as king. Andrew, however, was not going quietly. Just 4 days before the memoir hit the shelves, sensing the walls closing in, the Duke made a desperate, preemptive move. He announced that he would voluntarily relinquish his title as the Duke of York, hoping this gesture would be enough to satisfy his critics and allow him to keep some small vestige of his former life. In a carefully worded statement, he claimed he was putting duty to family and country first while still vigorously denying all of Virginia's allegations. But it was too little and it was far too late. The public saw it for what it was, a calculated attempt to save himself rather than an act of contrition. Behind the scenes, the standoff between the two brothers reached a breaking point. Andrew was fighting tooth and nail to keep his lifestyle at Royal Lodge, the 30-room mansion on the Windsor estate. He had held a 75-year lease on the property since 2003, and he refused to believe that his brother, the king, could simply cast him out into the cold. The prince made extraordinary, almost delusional demands in exchange for his silence in his departure. Insiders reported that he sought a financial settlement as high as $99 million. He demanded a full-time staff, including a chef, a gardener, and a driver, along with round-the-clock police protection, insisting that his future home must maintain the same standard of luxury he had enjoyed as a working royal. As October 2025 drew to a close, the tension within the palace walls was thick enough to breathe. The king was exhausted, his body weakened by illness, and his heart broken by the betrayal of both his wife and his brother. But he knew what had to be done. The ghost of Virginia Giuffre had spoken from the grave, and her voice was louder than any royal decree. On October 30th, 2025, Buckingham Palace released a statement that would change the history of the House of Windsor forever. The age of protection was over. The age of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor was about to begin, and it would be a life of isolation, far removed from the gilded halls he once called his birthright. The fall of a royal is never a quiet affair. It is a messy, loud, and public dismantling of a life built on the foundations of ancient privilege. While the world's cameras were fixed on the legal battles in New York and the dark connections to the Jeffrey Epstein scandal, another story was quietly brewing within the very heart of the palace. This was not a tale told by high-priced attorneys or strategic press offices, but by someone who lived in the quiet shadows of the Duke's daily life. To truly understand why the monarchy eventually felt the need to sever its ties with Prince Andrew, one must look past the international headlines and into the mundane, often surreal reality of his private quarters. In 1996, a 21-year-old woman from Yorkshire named Charlotte Briggs believed she had secured the opportunity of a lifetime. She had been hired as a maid at Buckingham Palace, a role that felt like a fairy tale for a young woman of her background. In the beginning, the job was everything she had hoped for. She spent her days cleaning majestic offices and sharing brief, human moments with members of the royal family who treated her with a level of decency she expected from such an institution. She remembered Prince Edward with particular fondness, noting that he would often hold the door open for her, a small, simple act of courtesy that made her feel seen and respected. However, after 6 months of general service, Charlotte was given the assignment that every staff member in the palace reportedly dreaded. She was sent to the nursery floor to serve Prince Andrew. At the time, Andrew was 36 years old. He was a veteran of the Falklands War, a man who had famously piloted helicopters under enemy fire, and he was newly divorced from Sarah Ferguson. But as Charlotte would soon discover, despite his military record and his status as a prince of the realm, his behavior behind closed doors was more akin to that of a petulant, spoiled child than a war hero. Charlotte's first taste of the prince's legendary temper came over something as trivial as a window treatment. She recalled an afternoon when Andrew was sitting just a few feet away from a window. Instead of standing up to adjust the drapes himself, he summoned Charlotte and demanded she do it for him. He sat in silence, watching her like a hawk as she ran up and down the stairs to adjust the heavy fabric to his exact minute specifications. When a tiny microscopic sliver of London sunlight managed to peek through the top of the curtains, his fury exploded. "Can't you do anything right?" he barked at the young maid. Charlotte was left in tears, stunned that a grown man could find such rage over a millimeter of light. This, she would later explain, was not an isolated incident. It was the daily reality of serving the Duke of York. But the most bizarre aspect of his private life, one that has since become a focal point of public ridicule, was his obsession with his collection of stuffed animals. Charlotte revealed that Andrew's bed was not merely a place for sleep. It was a meticulously maintained shrine to his childhood. Between 50 and 60 teddy bears were arranged on his bed every single day. This was not a casual pile of toys. It was a military operation that required extreme precision. The maids were reportedly issued a laminated diagram that showed the exact placement of every single bear. The largest bears had to be positioned at the back, leaning against the headboard, with the smaller ones tapering down in size toward the foot of the bed. 2 of his favorite bears were placed on mahogany thrones beside his bed. If a single bear was out of order, or if the royal crest on his embroidered pillows was not perfectly centered, Andrew would erupt into a shouting fit. Charlotte remembered the sheer hypocrisy of the situation, thinking to herself that this was a man who had faced the terrors of war, yet he could not function if a teddy bear was an inch out of place. There was also a deeply unsettling quality to the Duke's living quarters that Charlotte found difficult to ignore. Although he had been divorced from Sarah Ferguson since 1992, the Duchess of York's presence still haunted his rooms like a ghost. Charlotte claimed that Sarah's wedding dress still hung in Andrew's wardrobe years after the marriage had ended. Even more surreal was the fact that her makeup and perfumes remained laid out on his dressing table, neatly arranged as if she might walk back into the room at any moment. It painted a portrait of a man frozen in time, clinging to the wreckage of a past that the rest of the world had long since moved on from. These revelations might have been dismissed as the exaggerations of a disgruntled employee if they had not been corroborated by others who worked within the palace walls. Paul Page, a former palace guard, later spoke out in a major television documentary, confirming the prince's strange obsession with his bear protocol. He described the terrifying atmosphere that would descend upon the staff if the diagram was not followed to the letter. Even outsiders who visited the palace noticed the strange environment. The writer, Elizabeth Day, recounted a visit in 2019 where she sat in a corridor opposite a massive teddy bear perched on a chair. When she later asked Andrew about it, he simply laughed and explained it was a gift from Sarah. As these stories from the past resurfaced in 2022 and 2025, they served a specific purpose in the court of public opinion. They stripped away the last vestiges of royal dignity that Andrew had tried so hard to maintain. Through Charlotte's eyes, the Duke was not a victim of a grand conspiracy or a tragic figure caught in a media storm. He was, in her blunt words, a bad apple. He was a man so consumed by his own sense of entitlement that he had lost the ability to treat those around him with basic human empathy. For the king, these stories were the final pieces of a devastating puzzle. It was becoming clear that the decay within the Duke's character had started long before the world ever heard the name Jeffrey Epstein. The nursery floor had become a prison of his own making, and the walls were finally closing in. The battlefield for the soul of the modern monarchy was not a courtroom in New York or a podium in London. It was a sprawling 30-room mansion nestled deep within the private grounds of the Windsor estate. Royal Lodge, once the beloved and cherished home of the late Queen Mother, had become a fortress of ego and a symbol of the deepest rift in the House of Windsor. For Prince Andrew, the house was more than just a residence. It was the last tangible anchor to a life of royal splendor that was rapidly being stripped away. For King Charles, however, the lodge had become an embarrassing eyesore, a decaying monument to a brother who refused to accept that the world had moved on without him. The standoff at Royal Lodge was not merely a family dispute. It was an existential crisis for the king's vision of a slimmed-down monarchy. As Charles looked toward a future defined by duty and fiscal responsibility, he saw his brother's occupation of the massive estate as a direct contradiction to everything the new reign stood for. By late October of 2025, the situation had reached a state of total siege. The king had made it clear Andrew had to leave. But the Duke, clinging to a legal document signed in 2003, prepared for a final desperate stand. Andrew's defense was built on a 75-year lease he had secured more than 2 decades earlier. At the time, he had paid a single upfront sum of $1 million with the agreement that he would be responsible for all maintenance and refurbishment costs. But as the king's advisors conducted a secret status review of the property, they discovered a shocking reality. The Grand Mansion was rotting from the inside out. Reports from internal Crown Estate documents described a house plagued by severe dampness, peeling paint, and structural problems that would cost millions to repair. To the king, this was the ultimate betrayal of the lease agreement. If Andrew could not afford to maintain the dignity of a royal property, he had no right to live within its walls. But when the king's messengers arrived with the formal notice to vacate, they were met not with compliance, but with a list of demands that left the palace stunned. According to insiders close to the negotiations, Andrew did not just want a new house. He wanted a golden parachute. The Duke reportedly demanded a massive financial settlement before he would even consider signing over his lease, a figure that some sources claimed reached as high as $99 million. In Andrew's mind, this was not greed. It was compensation. He argued that by losing his royal status and his ability to earn an income, he was being deprived of the life he was promised at birth. He made it clear that he would not move into a simple home. He demanded a full-time staff to be funded by the Duke of Lancaster, including a private cook, a head gardener, a housekeeper, and a personal driver. Most contentiously, he insisted on round-clock top-tier police protection at his new residence, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. He was a man who no longer held an official royal position. Yet, he expected the British taxpayer or the king's private estate to maintain him, as if he were still a working prince of the realm. The standoff dragged on for weeks, becoming a public relations nightmare. Every day that Andrew remained at Royal Lodge was another day the monarchy looked weak and indecisive. The king was under immense pressure from his eldest son and heir, Prince William, who viewed Andrew's presence as a toxic stain on the family's reputation. William had reportedly told his father that the time for soft diplomacy within the family was over. He believed that the monarchy's survival depended on its ability to distance itself from scandal, and Andrew was the personification of the very scandals they needed to escape. On October 30th, 2025, King Charles finally reached his breaking point. He realized that as long as Andrew held the titles and honors of a prince, he would always believe he was entitled to the lifestyle of one. The king convened his legal team and issued a decree that was as historic as it was devastating. Using a rare and powerful legal instrument known as letters patent, the king initiated the formal process to strip his brother of every remaining marker of royal status. The announcement from Buckingham Palace was brief, but its finality sent shock waves through the country. The king had removed Andrew's style, his honors, and his very identity as a prince. He would no longer be known as His Royal Highness, Prince Andrew. Instead, he was to be referred to in all official capacities as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. It was a cold, clinical eraser of 65 years of royal history. By stripping him of the prince title, the king was signaling to the world and to Andrew that he was now a private citizen, subject to the same pressures and realities as anyone else. This move set a shocking precedent. It was the first time since the abdication of Edward VIII in 1936 that a high-ranking member of the British royal family had been so publicly and forcefully pushed aside by a reigning monarch. The statement from the palace even included a cutting clarification. These actions are deemed necessary for the protection of the institution, notwithstanding the individual's continued denial of the allegations against him. It was a clear admission that the king's priority was the crown, not his brother's feelings or his claims of innocence. The loss of status carried immediate and brutal financial consequences. The large yearly allowance that had funded Andrew's lifestyle was permanently cut off. The king made it clear that while he would not leave his brother homeless, the new residence would be a modest house on the Sandringham estate, far smaller and far less prestigious than the 30 rooms of Royal Lodge. There would be no army of gardeners, no private chefs, and no taxpayer-funded security detail. The collapse of Andrew's position was so total that he even had to negotiate for the future of his daughters, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie. Insiders suggested that Andrew had made a secret, desperate deal with Charles, pleading that his daughters' titles remain intact despite his own disgrace. The king, showing a rare moment of familial mercy, agreed. But the message was clear. The York dynasty, as a power center within the royal family, was dead. As the news of Andrew's total downfall reached the shores of California, it was met with a very different kind of silence. In the hills of Montecito, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle were watching the destruction of a royal life with growing alarm. They realized that the shield of being family had been shattered. If a king could do this to his own brother, a man who had lived his entire life behind palace walls, then no one was truly safe. The precedent had been set, and the Duke and Duchess of Sussex knew that their own titles were now hanging by a very thin thread. The fall of Andrew was not just the end of one man's journey. It was a warning to everyone who carried the name Windsor. 5,000 m away from the gray, rain-slick streets of London, nestled within the sun-drenched, high-walled sanctuary of Montecito, California, another royal storm was brewing. For Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, the news of Prince Andrew's total and absolute dismantling was not just a distant headline about a disgraced uncle. It was a terrifying glimpse into a future they had spent the last 4 years trying to outrun. As the official statement from Buckingham Palace flickered across their screens in late October 2025, the atmosphere inside their mansion reportedly shifted from curiosity to a cold, creeping alarm. The fall of Andrew had established what royal insiders were calling the Charles precedent. For the first time in modern history, a reigning monarch had proven that the titles given at birth or through marriage were not permanent birthrights. They were conditional privileges that could be revoked with a single stroke of a pen. This realization hit the Sussexes with the force of a tidal wave. If the king could strip his own brother, a man who had served in the military and lived his entire life within the firm of his prince title and his royal highness styling, then the titles of Duke and Duchess of Sussex were suddenly far more vulnerable than they had ever seemed before. Since their departure from official royal duties in 2020, Harry and Meghan had walked a delicate tightrope. They had agreed to stop using their His and Her Royal Highness styles in any official capacity, but they had clung to their Duke and Duchess titles with a fierce, almost desperate tenacity. To the world, these were not just labels. They were the foundation of a multi-million-dollar global brand. For Meghan in particular, the title of Duchess was the key that opened the doors to the most exclusive boardrooms in Hollywood, the most influential political circles in Washington, and the most lucrative media contracts with giants like Netflix. According to sources close to the couple, Meghan's reaction to the Andrew news was one of panicked defiance. Insiders reported that she had told friends in no uncertain terms, "No one is taking my Duchess title away." It wasn't just about the prestige. It was about the cold, hard reality of their California venture. Without those royal markers, the Sussexes would essentially become just another celebrity couple in a town already overflowing with them. Their influence in media, business, and charity work was inextricably linked to the perception that they were still in some way connected to the thousand-year-old institution of the British monarchy. If that connection were severed as completely as Andrew's had been, the very viability of their new lives would be at stake. The timing of this royal bombshell was particularly unsettling because the relationship between the Sussexes and the rest of the royal family remained deeply fractured. Harry and Meghan had spent years airing the family's dirty laundry and televised interviews, a record-breaking documentary series, and Harry's own explosive memoir. While they had enjoyed the freedom that came with their move to America, they had also underestimated the long memory of the institution they had left behind. Royal correspondent Rob Shooter reported that an insider told him Meghan understood the implications immediately. The Andrew precedent showed that the king was no longer afraid of the public fallout of slimming down the family. In fact, public opinion polls in Britain showed overwhelming support for the king's decisive action against Andrew. This created a dangerous environment for Harry and Meghan. If the public cheered when the king punished one troublesome royal, what was to stop him from doing the same to the others? However, the greatest source of anxiety in the Montecito household wasn't actually the king. It was the man who would come after him. Prince William's role in Andrew's downfall had been pivotal. It was no secret that William had been the one whispering in his father's ear, pushing for the most extreme measures to protect the crown's reputation. William was known to hold deep, simmering resentments about Harry's public criticisms of the family, and specifically the attacks on William's wife, the Princess of Wales. Harry knew all too well that while his father might be moved by a lingering sense of paternal love, William was a different kind of leader. William viewed the monarchy as a business that needed to be protected at all costs. To William, Harry and Meghan's continued use of their titles while they simultaneously attacked the institution was an act of hypocrisy that he would not tolerate forever. The Sussexes realized that even if they survived the reign of King Charles with their titles intact, they were only one heartbeat away from King William, who would have the power and likely the inclination to finish what his father had started. As the couple processed the news, reports began to circulate about emergency meetings with their own legal and branding advisors. They needed to find a way to insulate themselves from the Andrew effect. But the problem was that the more they tried to assert their royal status in America, the more they irritated the very people in London who held the power to take it away. They were caught in a vicious cycle. Meghan understood that a precedent had now been set. A monarch could remove both a dukedom and a princely title from his own flesh and blood. The security they thought they had purchased with their move to California was an illusion. The royal house was being cleaned, and the broom was moving faster and more ruthlessly than anyone had anticipated. As they looked out over their manicured gardens, the titles Duke and Duchess of Sussex felt less like honors and more like targets. And as the world turned its attention back to a seemingly minor incident at a royal funeral, Harry and Meghan realized that the next 7 seconds of history could decide their fate forever. The Duchess of Kent's funeral was held on September 16, 2025. It was a day of profound, heavy silence, the kind that only the British royal family can orchestrate with such somber perfection. Senior members of the family arrived dressed in layers of deepest black, their faces set in expressions of quiet mourning. Prince William and Princess Anne walked with a measured gait, embodying the stoic weight of royal duty in a time of loss. For a few hours, it seemed that the ancient rituals of the crown would provide a temporary shield against the scandals that had been battering the palace gates for months. But in the digital age, 1,000 years of tradition can be dismantled in a heartbeat. It was not the majestic ceremony or the poignant eulogies that captured the nation's attention in the days that followed. Instead, it was a fleeting 7-second moment filmed outside St. George's Chapel. The short clip showed Prince Andrew, the disgraced Duke of York, speaking to his former wife, Sarah Ferguson. On any ordinary day, the exchange would have appeared harmless, perhaps even touching a brief, cheerful moment between two people who had shared a lifetime of history. In this context, however, it was devastating. While the rest of the royal family stood as statues of grief, Andrew appeared relaxed, even amused. He leaned in, a smile playing on his lips, seemingly sharing a joke or a light-hearted comment with Sarah. Within hours, those 7 seconds would ignite a firestorm that no amount of palace damage control could extinguish. The footage began spreading across social media almost instantly. By midnight, it had reached more than 2 million views. The caption on one viral post read simply, "He's laughing at a funeral." Major newspapers and broadcasters seized on the story with a hunger that reflected the public's growing exhaustion with the Yorks. The Guardian described the moment as a stunning lapse of judgment that proved Andrew was utterly disconnected from the reality of his situation. The Telegraph went even further, calling it an optical nightmare for a monarchy already under immense strain. The public outrage was palpable. It was as if the nation had finally decided that they had seen enough. Within 48 hours, a private and urgent meeting was called at Clarence House. This was not a gathering of advisors. It was a gathering of the core family. Present were King Charles, Prince William, and Princess Anne. The agenda was short, explosive, and final. The future of the Yorks. For months, the king had tried to balance his role as a brother with his role as a sovereign. He had carried on with the same poise and composure that had defined him for decades, shaking hands with dignitaries and performing his duties with a calm, steady grace. But those who looked closely noticed the signs. His walk had become slower, and the burden of the Andrew problem was etched into the lines of his face. The funeral video was the tipping point for William and Anne. It was proof that Andrew would never understand the gravity of the damage he was doing to the institution. They argued that the Yorks had become a permanent liability, a source of constant, unnecessary drama that the crown could no longer afford. Behind the scenes, the king's advisors had already been reviewing the financial and structural state of royal tutelage, noting that it cost millions of pounds annually to maintain a property that the duke could not honestly afford to keep up. According to sources close to the crown estate, a new and ominous term began to appear in internal documents regarding the York status review. While Buckingham Palace declined to comment publicly, the whispers within the corridors of Windsor grew into a roar. The king was moving toward a decision that would be unprecedented in modern royal history. He was no longer just looking to remove Andrew from a house. He was looking to redefine what it meant to be a member of the royal family in the 21st century. The king's vision was of a slimmed-down monarchy, one focused entirely on service and duty, not on the preservation of unearned luxury or the shielding of scandalous behavior. He realized that the world no longer waits for official palace statements. The public reacts in real time to viral hashtags and 7-second clips. To survive, the monarchy had to be as agile and as ruthless as the media that scrutinized it. Prince Andrew, once a celebrated figure of the 1980s, whose wedding was watched by millions, now stood on the precipice of total erasure. His military titles were gone, his Royal Highness style was a memory, and his sanctuary at Royal Lodge was becoming his final battlefield. The mansion, with its grand gardens and echoes of the Queen Mother's laughter, was a relic of an era that the king was determined to close. This historic confrontation inside the royal household was about more than just a funeral or a house. It was about responsibility and the future of the crown itself. King Charles had reached a definitive conclusion. Sometimes to save the forest, you have to cut down the tree that is rotting at its center, no matter how deep its roots may go. As we look back on these intricate tales of drama, familial conflict, and the memoir that changed everything, we are left with a fundamental question. Which of these royal stories affected you the most? Do you believe King Charles made the right decision in his cold, clinical removal of Andrew's status? Or should family loyalty have come first in a time of personal and national transition? The House of Windsor has weathered many storms, but the Charles precedent has ensured that the rules of the game have changed forever. Share your thoughts with us in the comments section below. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the secrets of the palace. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will not want to miss what comes.